In the scorching Arizona summer of 1889, when the desert heat could kill a man faster than a rattler's bite, mercy was a luxury most folks couldn't afford. But Dr. Catherine Mills had never learned the difference between luxury and necessity when it came to saving lives. What she didn't know, as she worked by lamplight to extract a bullet from a dying stranger's chest, was that the man bleeding on her kitchen table had a $5,000 bounty on his head and the blood of 12 men on his hands. Sometimes the line between saint and sinner is thinner than a surgeon's blade, and sometimes saving one life means condemning your own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mercury in Catherine's thermometer had given up climbing. 3 days ago, surrendering somewhere past 110 degrees. The brass instrument sat useless on the windowsill of her small medical practice, a monument to the desert's relentless fury. Outside, Copper Ridge looked like a town carved from bone and desperation, its single main street baked white under the Arizona sun. The wooden sidewalks had warped and cracked, creating gaps wide enough for scorpions to nest, and the few remaining businesses hung their doors ajar, praying for any whisper of wind that might carry relief. Catherine pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, feeling the moisture evaporate almost instantly against her skin. Her dark hair, usually pinned back in the practical style befitting the territory's only female physician, had escaped its pins hours ago, clinging to her neck in damp tendrils. The white cotton of her dress, though modest and sensible, showed every drop of perspiration as she moved between her examination room and the small living quarters she'd carved out behind her practice. The drought had stretched into its 4th month now, turning the Verde River into a shallow trickle that barely sustained the town's dwindling population. Cattle lay dead in the fields, their ribs jutting through hide like broken fence posts. The few ranchers who hadn't already packed up and headed north spoke in whispers about selling their land to the copper mining company, though everyone knew the miners were struggling just as hard to keep their operations running without water. Catherine's medical bag sat open on her desk, its contents carefully rationed like everything else in Copper Ridge. She had 3 bottles of laudanum left, enough carbolic acid for perhaps a dozen more wound cleanings, and a dwindling supply of surgical thread that she'd been reusing after careful sterilization. Her last order of medical supplies had been delayed indefinitely in Tucson, the freight company claiming their horses couldn't make the journey in such heat. The irony wasn't lost on her in a place where death stalked every street corner. The tools to fight it became as precious as water. Her stomach was cramped with familiar hunger. The last proper meal she'd eaten had been 2 days ago, a thin soup made from the last of her preserved vegetables and a rabbit that old Pete Morrison had brought her in trade for setting his broken finger. The town's general store had closed its doors the previous week, its owner loading his family into a wagon and heading east toward friendlier territory. Those who remained in Copper Ridge did so either because they had nowhere else to go or because they were too stubborn to admit defeat. Catherine fell into both categories, the townspeople who still sought her services paid in whatever they could. Manage eggs from chickens too heat-addled to lay regularly, wilted vegetables from gardens struggling to survive, occasionally a silver dollar from someone who'd managed to sell something valuable. But most days, she worked for nothing more than the knowledge that someone lived who might otherwise have died. It was a luxury she could barely afford, but it was also the only thing that separated her from the vultures circling overhead, waiting for the town to finally surrender to the desert's hunger. A sudden commotion outside broke through her thoughts, the sound of horses moving fast, their hooves striking hard-packed earth with the urgency of pursuit. Catherine moved to her window, peering through the gap in her faded curtains. 3 riders thundered past her practice, dust billowing behind them in choking clouds. Even through the haze, she could see the glint of metal badges on their chests. Lawmen, riding hard in heat that should have killed their mounts. Whatever they were chasing must have been worth the risk. She watched until they disappeared toward the canyon road that led deeper into the territory, then returned to her desk where a letter lay half-written. It was addressed to her sister Margaret. In San Francisco, another attempt to explain why she couldn't simply abandon her practice and join the family's comfortable life in California. How could she make Margaret understand that leaving Copper Ridge would mean certain death for people who had no one else to turn to? How could she explain that the loneliness and hardship were prices she willingly paid for the privilege of being needed? The sound of approaching thunder made her look up hopefully, but the sky remained that merciless blue that had taunted them for weeks. Then she realized it wasn't thunder at all, but hoofbeats, a single horse moving fast along the main street. She returned to the window and saw a rider hunched forward in his saddle, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. The man's posture spoke of injury, and his mount moved with the exhausted desperation of an animal pushed beyond its limits. The horse stumbled, nearly going down, and the rider swayed dangerously to one side. Catherine grabbed her medical bag without thinking, her training overriding any questions about who this stranger might be or why he was riding so hard in such heat. She pushed through her front door just as the horse collapsed 20 yards from her practice, throwing its rider hard onto the sun-baked ground. The man didn't get up. Catherine ran across the street, her boots sinking into sand so hot it burned through the leather soles. The horse was done for. She could see that immediately. Its flanks heaved with the desperate rhythm of an animal in its final moments, white foam coating its muzzle as it lay on its side. But the rider still moved, one hand pressed against his side where his shirt had turned dark with blood. She knelt beside him, her medical instincts cataloging his condition even as she struggled to turn him over. Mid-30s, she estimated, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years in the saddle. His clothes were well made but dusty and torn, and his boots showed the kind of wear that came from long miles in rough country. Blood seeped between his fingers where he clutched his side, and his breathing came in short, shallow gasps that told her lung involvement was a serious concern, but it was his face that gave her pause. Even unconscious and streaked with dust and sweat, there was something about his features that struck her as familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. High cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of beard, and hair the color of winter wheat that had grown long enough to curl against his collar. He looked like money, even beaten down and bleeding in the street. "Help me," he whispered without opening his eyes, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. Catherine looked around quickly. The street was empty. Most sensible people were inside during the heat of the day, and the few businesses still operating had their shutters drawn tight against the sun. She could drag him into her practice alone, but it would be difficult, and moving him might worsen any internal injuries he'd sustained. Still, she'd taken an oath. She slipped her arms under his shoulders and began the slow, exhausting process of getting him to safety. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone, and by the time she'd managed to drag him across the threshold of her practice, both of them were soaked in sweat and blood. She kicked the door shut behind her and immediately went to work, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. His shirt was ruined, so she cut it away with her surgical scissors, revealing a muscled torso marred by old scars and fresh wounds. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the left side, and from the lack of an exit wound, she knew it was still inside him. But that wasn't the worst of it. A long gash across his shoulder blade spoke of a knife wound that had barely missed the major vessels, and his knuckles were split and swollen from recent fighting. This man had been in a war, and from the looks of it, he hadn't been winning. Catherine worked quickly to stem the bleeding, packing the bullet wound with clean gauze, while she prepared her instruments for surgery. She'd performed countless operations in this same room, but never on someone who looked quite so dangerous, even unconscious. Everything about him suggested violence, from the calluses on his gun hand to the way his muscles tensed even in unconsciousness, as if his body couldn't quite believe it was safe enough to relax. As she worked, she found herself wondering about those riders who'd passed earlier. Had they been hunting this man? The timing seemed more than coincidental, and the bullet wound was fresh, certainly no more than a few hours old. But whatever his story, whatever he'd done, her responsibility was clear. She was a physician, and he was dying on her table. The heat in the room was becoming unbearable. Sweat dripped from her face onto his chest as she worked, and she could feel her dress clinging to her back like a second skin. She'd need to work fast, not just because of his condition, but because the combination of heat, stress, and her own weakened state from poor nutrition was making her hands shake. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. Outside, the sun continued its relentless assault on Copper Ridge, and Catherine Mills worked by lamplight to save the life of a stranger who might very well be the most dangerous man she'd ever encountered. But as she probed for the bullet lodged near his spine, all she could think about was the simple fact that he was human. He was hurt, and he needed help. Everything else would have to wait until morning. The surgery took 3 hours. 3 hours of delicate work with instruments that had seen better days, in heat that made every movement an effort, with supplies she could barely afford to use. But when she finally extracted the bullet, a .45 caliber slug that had missed his vital organs by mere inches, and saw his breathing steady into the deeper rhythm of healing sleep, Catherine allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She'd saved another life in a place where life was cheap as dirt and twice as fragile. Whatever else this stranger might be, whatever crimes he might have committed or sins he might carry, tonight he would live because she'd been there when he needed help. She cleaned her instruments carefully, bandaged his wounds with the last of her good gauze, and settled into the wooden chair beside her examination table to keep watch. Outside, night was finally bringing some relief from the heat, but inside her small practice, the air still shimmered with the day's accumulated fury. As she sat there, listening to his steady breathing and watching for any signs of fever or complications, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. She'd opened her door to a stranger in need, just as she'd done countless times before, but something about this man felt different. Dangerous, yes, but also strangely familiar, as if she'd been waiting for him without knowing it. The oil in her lamp burned low, casting shifting shadows across his face. In sleep, he looked younger, less hardened, and she found herself wondering what kind of life had carved those scars across his body and etched those lines around his eyes. Whatever his story, whatever had brought him bleeding to her door, he was her responsibility now, and Catherine Mills had never been one to abandon her responsibilities. No matter how dangerous they might prove to be, dawn crept through the shutters like a thief, painting thin lines of gold across the floorboards of Catherine's practice. She jerked awake in the wooden chair, her neck stiff from sleeping upright, immediately checking on her patient. The stranger's breathing remained steady, but his skin felt warm to the touch, not the burning heat of fever, but the elevated temperature that often preceded infection. She'd need to change his dressing soon and check for signs of corruption in the wounds. The sound that had awakened her came again, heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk outside, moving with purpose. Catherine moved quietly to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. 5 men stood in the street, their horses tied to the hitching post across from her practice. Even in the early morning light, she could see the glint of badges on their vests and the way their hands rested casually near their weapons. These weren't the same riders from yesterday. These men moved with the confidence of those who expected cooperation, not resistance. The leader was a tall man with graying hair and a mustache that had seen better days. His clothes marked him as someone from outside Copper Ridge, too clean, too well fitted for desert living. A city marshal, perhaps, or a territorial lawman with jurisdiction that extended far beyond any single town. Behind him stood 4 deputies, younger men with the lean, weathered look of those who'd spent years tracking dangerous prey across unforgiving country. Catherine's mouth went dry as she watched them spread out, 2 men positioning themselves at either end of the street while the others approached the building systematically. They were searching for something or someone, and given the timing of their arrival and the condition of the man lying unconscious on her examination table, she had a sinking feeling she knew what they were hunting. A knock came at her door, firm but not aggressive. Catherine smoothed her hair, which had come completely loose during the night, and straightened her dress as best she could. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was about to unfold, then opened the door with what she hoped was a calm, professional expression. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Good morning, miss," the gray-haired man said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm U.S. Marshal William Crawford. We're looking for a man who might have passed through your town yesterday evening. Wounded, riding a bay horse, likely seeking medical. Attention." Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Dr. Catherine Mills. What's this man wanted for?" Marshal Crawford's eyes sharpened at her title. "Doctor? In a place like this?" He glanced past her shoulder, trying to see into the dim interior of her practice. "That's convenient. The man we're tracking is dangerous, Dr. Mills. Name's Nathaniel Blackwood, though he goes by several aliases. He's wanted for robbery, murder, and kidnapping across 3 territories. There's a $5,000 reward for his capture, dead or alive." The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Nathaniel Blackwood, she'd heard whispers of that name in the territories for years. The ghost of the Gila, some called him, because he seemed to vanish into the desert whenever the law got close. Stories followed him like smoke banks robbed in broad daylight, stagecoaches vanishing without a trace, entire posses found dead in the canyon country with no sign of their quarry. If the man on her table really was Nathaniel Blackwood, then she'd spent the night alone with one of the most wanted criminals in the American West. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Though I should mention, Marshal, that doctor-patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing my patients' conditions or identities without their consent." Crawford's mustache twitched in what might have been amusement. "That's a noble sentiment, Doctor, but it doesn't apply to wanted criminals. If you're harboring a fugitive, you could be charged as an accessory after the fact." Behind the marshal, one of his deputies shifted restlessly. "Boss, his horse is dead about 50 yards up the street. Looks like it's been there since yesterday." Catherine's stomach dropped. She'd completely forgotten about the horse that had collapsed in the street. In the chaos of getting the wounded man inside and performing surgery, she hadn't thought to move the animal or cover the evidence of what had happened. Crawford turned back to her, his eyes cold now. "That horse was stolen from a ranch outside Tucson 3 days ago, right after Blackwood killed the owner and his 2 sons. So I'll ask you again, Dr. Mills, have you seen the man we're hunting?" The weight of the decision pressed down on Catherine like a physical thing. Behind her, somewhere in the shadows of her practice, lay a man who might be one of the most dangerous killers in the territory. She could simply step aside, let the marshal and his men take him, and collect the $5,000 reward that would solve every problem she faced. With that money, she could resupply her practice, pay for proper food, maybe even hire help to handle the medical needs of Copper Ridge's remaining residents. But the oath she'd taken when she became a physician echoed in her mind. First, do no harm. She'd sworn to preserve life, not to serve as judge and jury over who deserved to live or die. Whatever crimes Nathaniel Blackwood might have committed, He'd come to her more dead than alive, seeking the same mercy she'd extend to any human being. In desperate need. And there was something else, something that nagged at the back of her mind. The man she'd operated on didn't match the descriptions she'd heard of the notorious outlaw. Blackwood was supposed to be a cold-blooded killer, a man who showed no mercy to his victims. But the stranger in her care had whispered, "Help me," with the voice of someone genuinely afraid, someone who seemed more desperate than dangerous. "Marshal Crawford," she said carefully, "I understand you have a job to do, but I need to see some proper identification and a warrant before I can allow you to search my practice. This is private property, and I have patients who deserve privacy and dignity regardless of their circumstances." Crawford's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, lady. Blackwood isn't the kind of man who inspires loyalty. He's a killer, pure and simple. If you're protecting him, you're putting your own life at risk." "I'm not protecting anyone," Catherine replied. "I'm simply insisting that you follow proper legal procedures. If you have evidence that a crime has been committed on my property, then show me a warrant signed by a judge. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you and your men to leave." The silence that followed stretched like a wire drawn too tight. Crawford studied her face, clearly trying to decide whether she was bluffing or simply naive about what she was up against. Behind him, his deputies waited for orders, their hands never straying far from their weapons. "You've got backbone, Doctor, I'll give you that," Crawford finally said. "But backbone won't stop a bullet, and Nathaniel Blackwood has put bullets in better people than you. If he's in there, he's already planning how to use you as a shield when we come for him." "Then you'll need that warrant," Catherine said firmly. Crawford stepped closer, lowering his voice so his deputies couldn't hear. "Listen to me very carefully, Dr. Mills. I've been tracking Blackwood for 2 years. I've seen what he does to people who get in his way. Last month, he burned down a homestead outside Phoenix because the family wouldn't tell him where they'd hidden their savings. The husband survived long enough to describe how Blackwood made him watch while Crawford stopped himself, shaking his head. "This isn't the man you want to trust with your life." Catherine felt sick, but she stood her ground. "That may be true, Marshal, but without proper legal authority, I can't help you. Medical ethics and the law both protect my patient's privacy." For a moment, she thought Crawford might simply push past her and search the building anyway. The territorial justice system was rough around the edges, and many lawmen operated with more authority than the law strictly granted them. But after a long moment, he stepped back and signaled to his deputies. "We'll be back with that warrant, Dr. Mills. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. Nathaniel Blackwood isn't worth dying for, and if you're protecting him, that's exactly what you're doing." The marshal and his men mounted their horses and rode toward the territorial courthouse in the county seat, a half-day's ride south of Copper Ridge. Catherine watched them disappear into the shimmering heat haze, then closed and barred her door. She had perhaps 8 hours before they returned with legal authority to search her practice. 8 hours to decide what she was going to do with the most wanted man in 3 territories. She returned to her patient's side and checked his wounds. The bleeding had stopped completely, and while his skin was warm, it didn't feel like the burning heat of infection. His breathing was deeper now, more natural, and when she lifted his eyelids to check his pupils, they responded normally to the light. He was healing, remarkably quickly for someone who'd been so close to death just hours earlier. As she changed his bandages, Catherine found herself studying his face more carefully. In sleep, he looked younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps early 30s rather than mid-30s. His hands, when she examined them for other injuries, showed calluses that spoke of hard work, but also a kind of precision that suggested skill with tools and weapons. These weren't the soft hands of a man who lived by pure violence. They belonged to someone who'd learned to work with his hands long before he'd learned to fight. More puzzling were the scars. She'd treated enough gunshot victims to recognize The marks left by different weapons, and this man's body told a complex story. Some of the older scars looked like they'd come from legitimate fights, the kind of wounds a lawman or soldier might accumulate in the line of duty. Others suggested more questionable encounters, including what looked like a knife wound across his shoulder blade that had barely missed the subclavian artery, but it was the newest scar that gave her the most pause. Just above his heart almost. Hidden by the dark hair on his chest was a small, perfectly round mark that could only have come from a bullet wound. The scar was old at least 2 years, she estimated, but it was positioned exactly where a shot would have been fatal if it had been just a fraction of an inch to the right. Someone had tried to kill this man by shooting him in the heart, and somehow he'd survived. Catherine sat back in her chair, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what Marshal Crawford had told her. If this really was Nathaniel Blackwood, the notorious outlaw and killer, then why did his body tell the story of someone who'd been hunted rather than someone who did the hunting? Why did he look more like a man running from something than a man who terrorized others for profit? A soft groan from the examination table interrupted her thoughts. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening. As consciousness returned, when his gaze found hers, Catherine saw something she hadn't expected, not the cold calculation of a killer, but the wary gratitude of someone who'd been saved when he'd expected to die. "Water," he whispered, his voice rough from hours of unconsciousness. Catherine helped him drink from a tin cup, supporting his head while he sipped slowly. When he'd had enough, she set the cup aside and met his eyes directly. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. He studied her face for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth he could afford to tell. "Nathan," he finally said. "Nathan Blake." Close enough to Nathaniel Blackwood to be plausible, but different enough to maintain some deniability. Catherine appreciated the honesty, even if it was only partial. "Well, Nathan Blake," she said, "you need to know that there are men looking for you, U.S. Marshals with warrants and guns and very specific ideas about what should happen to you. They'll be back before nightfall, and when they come, they'll have the legal authority to search this building." Nathan tried to sit up, then fell back with a sharp intake of breath as the movement pulled at his stitches. "How long was I out?" "About 10 hours. You were dying when you got here. Blood loss, possible internal injuries, exhaustion. I managed to remove the bullet and repair the damage, but you're still in no condition to travel." "I have to go," he said, struggling again to rise. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into by helping me." Catherine placed a firm hand on his chest, keeping him flat on the table. "I understand more than you think. I know who you're supposed to be, and I know what the marshal says you've done. What I don't understand is why a woman with doctor's training and sworn medical ethics should become judge, jury, and executioner for a man she's never met." Nathan stared at her, clearly surprised by her directness. "You know who I am, and you're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," Catherine admitted. "But not of you. I'm afraid of what happens to this town if I start deciding which lives are worth saving and which aren't. I'm afraid of what happens to me as a physician if I let fear override my oath to do no harm." "The marshal was right about one thing," Nathan said quietly. "I am dangerous. Not in the way he thinks, maybe, but dangerous all the same. People who help me tend to end up dead." "Then maybe," Catherine said, beginning to clean the surgical instruments she'd used during the night, "it's time someone helped. You figure out how to be less dangerous, starting with getting you healthy enough to make better choices than bleeding to death in a stranger's street." Nathan closed his eyes, and for a moment, Catherine thought he'd fallen back into unconsciousness. Then he spoke again, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk everything for someone you don't even know?" Catherine looked at the man on her table, wounded, wanted, and seemingly genuinely puzzled by the concept of mercy offered without condition. Whatever crimes he might have committed, whatever darkness might follow in his wake. Right now he was simply a human being who needed help. And Catherine Mills had spent too many years in the desert to start refusing help to those who needed it most, because, she said simply, it's what doctors do. Outside, the sun climbed higher into a merciless sky, and somewhere to the south, Marshall Crawford was securing the legal authority he needed to tear apart Catherine's practice in search of the most wanted man in 3 territories. But inside the small, stuffy room that served as both home and hospital, a physician continued the work she'd always done, healing the wounded, regardless of who they were or what they'd done to deserve their pain. The impossible choice had been made. Now she would have to live with the consequences. Nathan dozed fitfully through the morning hours, his body fighting between the need for rest and the instinct to flee. Every time he stirred, Catherine checked his pulse and temperature, monitoring for signs of fever or complications. His wounds were healing cleanly, but she knew that infection could set in quickly in this heat, especially with the stress his body was under. Around midday, when the temperature inside her practice had climbed to nearly unbearable levels, Nathan opened his eyes and spoke with more clarity than he'd shown since his arrival. "Dr. Mills," he said, his voice still rough but stronger now, "I need you to understand something. The men who are hunting me, they're not entirely wrong about what I've done." Catherine paused in her inventory of medical supplies. She'd been trying to calculate how much laudanum she could spare if his pain worsened, but his words demanded her full attention. "I'm listening," she said simply. Nathan struggled to prop himself up on one elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. 3 months ago, I robbed the Territorial Bank in Flagstaff. Took nearly $8,000. A week before that, I held up a stagecoach carrying mining payroll outside Prescott. The week before that, a train carrying silver from the mines near Tombstone. Catherine sat down heavily in her chair. The crimes he was confessing to weren't the work of a desperate man driven to violence by circumstances. They were the calculated actions of someone who'd made a career out of taking what belonged to others. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know what kind of man you're risking your life to protect," Nathan said. "And because the truth is more complicated than what Marshall Crawford told you." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. Catherine could see the effort it cost him to continue, not just physically but emotionally. Whatever he was about to reveal clearly came at a price. The homestead Crawford mentioned, the family that was killed outside Phoenix that wasn't me, but I know who did it, and I know why my name gets attached to crimes I didn't commit. Nathan's eyes met hers, and she saw something she hadn't expected, not just pain, but a deep, abiding anger that seemed to burn just beneath the surface. 2 years ago, I was a deputy marshal working out of Tucson. My partner was a man named Samuel Garrett, and we'd been tracking a gang of outlaws who'd been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory. They called themselves the Crimson Creek Gang after the first place they hit, where they left 12 people dead, including 3 children. Catherine felt her breath catch. She'd heard of Crimson Creek, everyone in the territory had. It had been one of the most brutal massacres in Arizona's recent history, and the men responsible had never been caught. "We finally got a lead on their hideout in the canyon country near the Mexican border," Nathan continued. "But when we rode in to make arrests, we found out that Garrett had been feeding information to the gang all along. He'd set up the whole thing as a trap." Nathan's hand moved unconsciously to the old scar above his heart, the perfectly round mark that Catherine had noticed during her examination. "Garrett shot me point blank and left me for dead. Told the gang I was getting too close to the truth about their operation, which included several prominent businessmen in Tucson who were funding their activities in exchange for a cut of the profits." "But you survived," Catherine said quietly. "Apache found me 3 days later. They had no love for the white man's law, but they had even less love for the men who'd been raiding their hunting grounds. and killing their people. They patched me up, and when I was strong enough to travel, they told me something that changed everything." Nathan paused to drink more water, clearly struggling with both physical pain and the emotional weight of his story. Catherine waited, sensing that what came next would explain everything about how a deputy marshal had become the most wanted man in 3 territories. "The gang wasn't just robbing banks and stagecoaches," Nathan said. "They were being used to clear out homesteaders and small ranchers whose land sat on top of copper deposits. The businessmen funding them wanted the land, but they needed the families gone first. So they'd send the gang to make it look like random violence, then buy up the land from the territorial government for practically nothing." Catherine felt sick. She'd heard rumors of such schemes, but she'd always hoped they were just the paranoid fantasies of people looking for someone to blame for their hardships. To learn that there really were men orchestrating such cruelty for profit made her question everything she thought she knew about the territory she'd chosen to serve. "When I tried to expose the conspiracy, I found out how deep it went," Nathan continued. "Federal marshals, territorial judges, even some military officers at Fort Lowell. They had enough people in their pocket to make sure any evidence I presented would disappear and any charges I brought would be dismissed." "So you decided to take justice into your own hands," Catherine said. "I decided to take their money," Nathan corrected. "Every bank I've robbed, every stagecoach I've held up, they were all connected to the conspiracy. The Territorial Bank in Flagstaff was where they laundered money from their land deals. The mining payroll I took was being used to pay off corrupt officials. The silver shipment was headed to buyers who were part of the operation." Catherine stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. "You're telling me you became an outlaw to fight corruption?" "I became an outlaw because it was the only way to hurt them where they'd feel it," Nathan said. "And because every dollar I took was a dollar they couldn't use to fund more massacres like Crimson Creek." "What about the murders?" Catherine asked. "Crawford said you'd killed people." Nathan's expression hardened. "I've killed men who were trying to kill me. I've killed men who were part of the conspiracy and wouldn't be brought to justice any other way. But I've never killed anyone who didn't have blood on their hands." Catherine stood and walked to the window, peering out at the empty street. The heat had driven everyone indoors, leaving Copper Ridge looking like a ghost town. In a few hours, Marshal Crawford would return with his warrant and his men, and she would have to decide whether to believe the story Nathan had just told her. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked without turning around. "You don't," Nathan admitted. "But ask yourself this, if I really was the cold-blooded killer Crawford described, why haven't I threatened you? Why haven't I taken your medical supplies and forced you to patch me up at gunpoint? Why haven't I used you as a hostage to negotiate my way out of this situation?" Catherine had been wondering the same thing. In all the stories she'd heard about dangerous outlaws, they inevitably turned violent when cornered. But Nathan had done none of those things. He'd been honest about his crimes, grateful for her help, and seemed genuinely concerned about the danger his presence put her in. "There's something else," Nathan said. "In my saddlebags, if Crawford's men haven't taken them already, you'll find letters. Communications between members of the conspiracy, documenting their plans and payments. I've been collecting evidence for 2 years, building a case that might finally bring them to justice." "Then why haven't you taken it to federal authorities?" "In Washington?" Catherine asked. "Because I'm a wanted man now. No one would believe anything I had to say, even with documentary evidence. But if that evidence were to fall into the hands of someone with credibility, someone with no connection to territorial corruption." Nathan looked at her meaningfully. Catherine turned from the window to face him. "You want me to become part of your crusade?" "I want you to have options," Nathan said. "When Crawford comes back, you can turn me over and collect the reward money. Or you can help me get to someone who can use that evidence to stop the real killers. And if I choose to help you, what happens to me?" Crawford already suspects I'm hiding you. If I'm caught helping you escape, I'll be charged as an accomplice." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of genuine regret. "Then you'll become an outlaw, just like me. And you'll learn what it's like to be hunted by men who care more about maintaining their power than finding the truth." Catherine returned to her chair, her mind reeling with the implications of what Nathan had told her. If his story was true, then she was being asked to choose between turning in a man who was fighting corruption and becoming part of a conspiracy herself. If his story was false, then she was being manipulated by a master criminal who was using her compassion against her. Either way, her life in Copper Ridge was about to end. Crawford would never believe she'd been ignorant of Nathan's identity, and even if she convinced him she'd been deceived, her reputation as a physician would be destroyed. No one would trust a doctor who'd harbored the territory's most wanted criminal, regardless of her reasons. "There's a third option," Nathan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "You could come with me." Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A female physician traveling with a wanted outlaw? We wouldn't last 2 days." "You'd be surprised how much cover respectability provides," Nathan said. "Most people see a well-dressed woman traveling with her husband and assume they're legitimate. And there are places in this territory where a doctor would be welcome, no questions asked." "Places where you could continue your robbery career, you mean?" "Places where we could build evidence strong enough to bring down the conspiracy," Nathan corrected. "Places where we could find the men responsible for Crimson Creek and dozens of other atrocities." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to think clearly despite the heat and exhaustion that clouded her judgment. Everything she'd worked for in Copper Ridge would be lost if she helped Nathan escape. Her practice, her home, her reputation, all of it would disappear the moment she chose to trust the word of a confessed criminal over the authority of federal law enforcement. But if Nathan was telling the truth, then staying would mean watching him die for crimes he didn't commit, while the real killers continued their work unimpeded. It would mean accepting that corruption was too powerful to fight, and that justice was a luxury the territory couldn't afford. The sound of approaching horses broke through her thoughts. Catherine moved to the window and felt her heart sink. Crawford and his deputies were returning, and they were arriving earlier than expected. The dust cloud behind them suggested they'd pushed their mounts hard to get back to Copper Ridge before nightfall. "They're coming," she said. Nathan tried to sit up, his face pale but determined. "Dr. Mills, Catherine, you need to decide now. Will you help me, or will you turn me over to men who may not be interested in justice?" Catherine looked at the man on her examination table, wounded, wanted, and possibly telling the truth about a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Then she looked out the window at the approaching lawmen, riding hard to capture a criminal who might be the only person standing between corrupt officials and their next atrocity. The impossible choice had become even more impossible. But as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, Catherine Mills realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were tests of character, moments when a person discovered what they truly believed about justice, mercy, and the price of doing what was right. And as Marshal Crawford's voice called out for her to open her door, Catherine made her decision. Catherine's hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as her mind raced through possibilities. She grabbed her emergency medical kit, a smaller version of her main supplies that she kept ready for house calls, and stuffed it with laudanum, surgical thread, and bandages. If she was going to make this choice, she needed to be prepared for the consequences. "Can you walk?" she asked Nathan, helping him sit up despite his obvious pain. "I can manage," he said through gritted teeth, swinging his legs over the side of the examination table. His face went pale with the effort, but he remained upright. The sound of Marshal Crawford's voice carried through the door. "Dr. Mills, open up. We have a warrant." Catherine moved to her back window, the one that faced the alley behind her practice. The narrow space between buildings was empty, but it wouldn't provide cover for long. Beyond the alley lay the canyon country rough, terrain that could hide a person indefinitely if they could survive the heat and the hostile landscape. "There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards," she told Nathan quietly. "It was meant for storing preserves, but it's deep enough to hide in. The entrance is behind that cabinet." Nathan shook his head. "They'll find it eventually. And when they do, they'll know you helped me." The pounding on the front door grew more insistent. Crawford's voice again. "Dr. Mills, we know you're in there. Open this door, or we'll break it down." Catherine made her decision with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis. She moved to her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, writing quickly in the clear, precise handwriting that had marked her medical notes for years. "What are you doing?" Nathan asked. "Leaving a message for whoever comes after me," Catherine said, still writing. "The people of Copper Ridge deserve medical care, even if I can't provide it anymore." She folded the letter and placed it prominently on her desk, then moved to help Nathan toward the back window. His saddlebags sat in the corner where she'd placed them after dragging him. Inside, somehow, Crawford's men had missed them in their earlier search of the street. "Your evidence," she said, shouldering the bags. "We'll need it." The front door splintered under the impact of something heavy, probably the marshal's boot or the butt of a rifle. Catherine could hear multiple voices now, men spreading through her practice with the systematic efficiency of those who'd done this many times before. Nathan gripped the window frame, his knuckles white with pain and effort. "Catherine, you don't have to do this. You can still tell them I forced you, that I threatened you." "No," she said firmly, climbing through the window first and then turning to help him. "I've made my choice." They dropped into the alley just as Catherine heard Crawford's voice from inside her practice. "Search every room. Check for hiding places." The alley provided temporary concealment, but Catherine knew it wouldn't last long. Once the marshals realized Nathan wasn't inside, they'd expand their search to the surrounding area. She and Nathan needed to be far away before that happened. "The livery stable," she whispered, pointing toward a weathered building at the end of the alley. "Old Pete Morrison keeps horses there. If we can—" "Dr. Mills." Crawford's voice boomed from the broken doorway of her practice. "I know you can hear me. If you're protecting Blackwood, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." Nathan pulled Catherine into the shadow of a wooden water barrel, their bodies pressed close together as they waited for the marshal's attention to turn elsewhere. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the rapid beating of his heart, and the tremor in his hands that spoke of pain barely held in check. "This is insane," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Probably," Nathan agreed, "but it's the right kind of insane." They moved through the alley in a crouched run, using barrels, crates, and abandoned equipment as cover. The livery stable loomed ahead, its doors standing open to catch any breeze that might provide relief from the oppressive heat. Inside, Catherine could see the shapes of horses, their heads hanging low in the stifling air. Pete Morrison emerged from the stable's depths, leading a mare that looked as exhausted as everything else in Copper Ridge. He was a grizzled man in his 60s, weathered by decades of desert living, but his eyes were sharp, and he'd always been kind to Catherine during her years in the town. "Doc?" Pete said, clearly surprised to see her creeping through the alley. "What in tarnation?" "Pete," Catherine interrupted. "I need 2 horses. The strongest ones you have. And I need them right now." Pete's gaze shifted to Nathan, taking in his pale complexion, the way he favored his left side, and the unmistakable signs of recent injury. "This have something to do with all the commotion over at your place?" "The less you know, the better," Catherine said. "But Pete, I've never asked you for anything I didn't need. I'm asking now." The old man studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That bay gelding there, he's got stamina. The roan marring next to him ain't pretty, but she'll carry you to hell and back if you need her to. I don't have money to pay you, Catherine admitted. Pete waved dismissively. You set my broken finger last month, remember? And you didn't charge. Me nothing for it neither. Consider this paying forward. As Pete began saddling the horses, Nathan leaned against a stall door, his breathing labored. Catherine checked his bandages quickly, relieved to see that the physical exertion hadn't reopened. His wounds. Where are we going? She asked quietly. North, Nathan said. There's a place in the mountains where we'll be safe, at least temporarily. Apache territory. The marshals won't follow us there without a full military escort. Catherine felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Apache territory? Nathan, that's the only place where the corruption hasn't reached, he finished. And I have friends there. People who know the truth about what's been happening in this territory. Pete finished with the horses and handed Catherine the reins. You take care of yourself, Doc. This town's going to miss you something fierce. Take care of the people as best you can, Catherine said, squeezing the old man's weathered hand. And Pete, if anyone asks, you never saw us. Pete's eyes twinkled. With something that might have been mischief. Saw who? They led the horses through the back of the stable and out into the desert beyond Copper Ridge. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, but the heat remained brutal. Catherine's dress was already soaked with perspiration, and she could see that Nathan was struggling more than he wanted to admit. Behind them, they could hear shouts from the town as Crawford's search expanded. The marshals had discovered Nathan's absence and were now questioning anyone they could find about his possible whereabouts. It would only be a matter of time before someone mentioned seeing Catherine and a stranger near the livery stable. We need to move faster, Nathan said, pulling himself into the saddle with obvious difficulty. Catherine mounted her own horse, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted on during her childhood in Pennsylvania. The skills she'd learned on her family's farm seemed like they belonged to another lifetime, but muscle memory took over as she settled into the Marais gait. They rode hard for the first hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves. And Copper Ridge, the landscape around them was unforgiving. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush and dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels in the dying light. To the north, the mountains rose in purple silhouettes against the sky, promising cooler temperatures, but also terrain that would test both horses and riders to their limits. As they climbed into the foothills, Nathan finally called a halt near a cluster of rocks that provided some shelter from observation. Both horses were lathered with sweat, and Nathan looked like he might fall from his saddle if they continued much longer. We need to rest, Catherine said, dismounting and immediately checking Nathan's condition. His pulse was rapid but steady, and while his bandages showed some seepage, there was no sign of fresh bleeding. Can't stop long, Nathan said, accepting the water she offered from her canteen. Crawford's good at what he does. He'll figure out our trail soon enough. Catherine looked back toward Copper Ridge, now just a smudge of buildings in the distance. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could make out the tiny figures of riders moving through the streets. Her life there was over. She understood that completely now. Everything she'd built over the past 3 years was gone, sacrificed for a man she barely knew and a cause she was only beginning to understand. Tell me about these friends of yours, she said, settling onto a flat rock beside him. The ones in Apache territory. Nathan was quiet for a moment, staring out at the desert they'd just crossed. Their leader is a man named Victorio. He's been fighting the government's attempts to force his people onto reservations, but he's also been trying to protect them from the gang that's been raiding their hunting grounds. The same gang you were investigating? The same one. Victorio lost his youngest son in one of their raids, a boy not even 16 years old. When I told him what I'd learned about the conspiracy, about the men who were funding the violence against his people, he agreed to help me gather evidence. Catherine, felt a growing understanding of the complexity of the situation she'd walked into. This wasn't just about corruption in the territorial government, it was about a systematic campaign of violence against anyone who stood in the way of powerful men's ambitions. What kind of evidence? She asked. Nathan reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the elements. Inside were dozens of documents, letters, bank records, military correspondence, and what appeared to be contractual agreements. Communications between Samuel Garrett and his contacts in Tucson, Nathan explained, showing her a letter written in a flowing script. Bank records showing payments to the Crimson Creek Gang through intermediaries. Military orders that directed patrols away from areas where raids were planned. Catherine studied the documents with growing horror. The conspiracy was even more extensive than Nathan had described. It reached into the territorial capital, the federal bureaucracy, and the military command structure. The men involved weren't just stealing land. They were orchestrating a campaign of ethnic cleansing designed to clear the territory of anyone who might interfere with their mining and ranching operations. "This is evidence of genocide," she said quietly. "And it's evidence that would disappear the moment I tried to present it through official channels," Nathan replied. "Too many of the people who would receive it are part of the conspiracy themselves." Sound from the desert below made them both freeze, the distant thunder of hoofbeats growing closer. Catherine peered through the rocks and saw a line of riders moving across the desert floor, following the same path they'd taken into the foothills. "Crawford," Nathan said grimly. "He's better at tracking than I hoped." They mounted quickly, Nathan, gritting his teeth against the pain of movement. The trail ahead wound higher into the mountains, following ancient deer paths and Apache routes that few white men knew. But Catherine could see that Nathan was weakening. The combination of his injuries, the heat, and the stress of hard riding was taking its toll. "How much farther?" she asked as they climbed higher. 2 hours to the canyon where Victorio's people are camped," Nathan said. "If we can make it that far, we'll be safe." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew stronger. Crawford and his men were gaining ground, their fresher horses making better time than the mounts Catherine and Nathan had pushed hard through the desert heat. The race had become a simple matter of endurance, whether Nathan could stay in his saddle long enough to reach Sanctuary. As they crested a ridge, Catherine caught her first glimpse of their destination, a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside, its walls rising sheer and high on both sides. Smoke from cooking fires drifted up from its depths, and she could see the tiny figures of people moving among what appeared to be temporary shelters. "There," Nathan said, pointing toward the canyon mouth. "Once we're inside, Crawford won't dare follow. He doesn't have the men or the authority to fight the Apache on their own ground." But even as he spoke, Catherine could see that they had a problem. The trail to the canyon was exposed, crossing open ground where they would be visible to their pursuers for several minutes. If Crawford's men were close enough, they might be able to cut them off before they reached safety. "Nathan," she said, "I don't think we're going to make it." Nathan looked back at the dust cloud rising behind them, calculating distances and time. With the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years being hunted, his expression was grim when he turned back to her. "Maybe not both of us," he said quietly. Catherine understood immediately what he was suggesting, and her response was swift and decisive. "No, we stay together. If we don't make it, we don't make it, but I'm not abandoning you now." "Catherine, listen to me." "No, you listen to me," she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned to project in medical emergencies. "I've made my choice, and I'm not changing it now. We reach that canyon together, or we face Crawford together. But we don't split up." Nathan stared at her for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since he'd arrived bleeding on her examination table. "You're quite a woman, Dr. Catherine Mills." "Yes," she said, urging her horse toward the canyon. "Trail, I am. They rode across the exposed ground at a full gallop, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the rocky trail. Behind them, Catherine could hear shouts as Crawford's men spotted them and spurred their own mounts to greater speed. The race was on, and everything depended on the next few minutes. The canyon mouth loomed ahead, dark and promising safety. Catherine could see Apache warriors emerging from concealment among the rocks. Their weapons ready but held low, they were waiting to see who would reach the canyon first. A rifle shot cracked across the desert, and Catherine felt her hat fly from her head as the bullet passed close enough to ruffle her hair. Crawford's men were within range now, and they were shooting to wound or disable rather than kill. They wanted their prisoners alive. Almost there. Nathan shouted over the sound of gunfire. The canyon mouth was 50 yards away, then 30, then 20. Catherine could see the faces of the Apache warriors now. Could see their leader, a man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter storms, raising his hand in what might have been a greeting or warning. Another shot rang out, and this time Nathan's horse stumbled, blood streaming from a wound in its flank. The animal tried to continue but collapsed 20 yards from safety, throwing Nathan hard against the rocky ground. Catherine wheeled her horse around without thinking, dismounting even as Crawford's men thundered toward them. Nathan was struggling to his feet, blood seeping through his bandages where the fall had reopened his wounds. "Leave me," he gasped. "Never," Catherine said, getting her shoulder under his arm and helping him toward the canyon mouth. The Apache warriors were moving now, flowing down from the rocks like shadows given substance. Their leader stepped forward, and Catherine saw him make a gesture that caused his men to raise their weapons toward the approaching marshals. "You are under the protection of the Apache Nation," the gray-haired leader called out in accented but clear English. "These are our guests. You will go no farther." Marshal Crawford reined in his horse 20 yards away, his face dark with frustration and anger. His deputies spread out behind him, their weapons drawn but not aimed. They knew better than to provoke a firefight with Apache warriors on their own ground. "Those people are fugitives from federal justice," Crawford shouted. "I have warrants for their arrest." "Your warrants have no meaning here," the Apache leader replied calmly. "This is sovereign territory. Your authority ends where ours begins." Catherine helped Nathan into the canyon's shadow, where Apache women immediately came forward to assist with his injuries. She looked back at Crawford one last time, seeing the promise of future pursuit in his cold eyes. "This isn't over, Dr. Mills," the marshal called out. "You can't hide behind the Apache forever." "Perhaps not," Catherine called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I can hide long enough to see justice done." As they disappeared into the canyon's depths, leaving Crawford and his men staring helplessly from the desert floor, Catherine realized that her leap of faith had carried her farther than she'd ever imagined possible. She was no longer Dr. Catherine Mills of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory. She was something new, something she hadn't expected to become. She was an outlaw with a cause, and for the first time since this all began, that didn't frighten her nearly as much as it should have. Apache camp lay hidden in a maze of red stone corridors that twisted deep into the mountain's heart. Catherine followed Nathan and their escorts through passages so narrow that sunlight barely penetrated, then emerged into a hidden valley where cool springs fed patches of green grass and ancient cottonwood trees provided blessed shade. After the brutal heat of the desert, the temperature here felt almost cold against her sweat-soaked skin. Victoria's people had created a temporary settlement that could be dismantled and moved at a moment's notice. Hide-covered structures clustered near the water sources, while horses grazed in carefully guarded meadows. Children played in the shadows of the canyon walls, their laughter echoing off stone that had sheltered their ancestors for countless generations. It was a place of refuge, but Catherine could see the watchful eyes of warriors posted at every vantage point, even here. Safety was never taken for granted. "Your friend needs immediate attention," said Elena, an Apache woman who had introduced herself as the camp's medicine keeper. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone skilled in healing arts. The fall reopened his wounds, and there are signs of fever beginning. Catherine nodded, falling into the familiar rhythm of medical assessment, despite the surreal circumstances. Nathan was conscious but clearly weakening, his skin hot to the touch and his breathing becoming more labored. They had reached safety, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Elena led them to a shelter near the springs, where the sound of running water would mask their voices from any listeners beyond. The camp's perimeter. Inside, the structure was larger than it appeared from outside, with carefully arranged supplies that spoke of both Apache traditional medicine and modern medical knowledge acquired through necessity. "You are the physician Nathan spoke of," Elena said as they settled Nathan onto a bed of soft hides and woven blankets. "He said you saved his life in the desert town." "I tried to," Catherine replied, already examining Nathan's bandages. "But I'm not sure I succeeded. These wounds are beyond what my limited supplies can handle, especially without proper surgical facilities." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Perhaps you judge your success too quickly. Nathan Blake has been dying for 2 years, not from bullets, but from carrying too much weight alone. You gave him something more valuable than surgery. What's that?" "Hope that someone else might share the burden." As they worked together to treat Nathan's injuries, Catherine found herself impressed by Elena's medical knowledge. The Apache woman used techniques that combined traditional plant medicines with surgical procedures that wouldn't have been out of place in a Philadelphia hospital. When Catherine commented on this, Elena's expression grew sad. "My husband was a cavalry surgeon before the war," she explained, grinding willow bark into powder to reduce Nathan's fever. "Dr. James Morrison, perhaps you know the name? He worked for the Territorial Medical Service before he learned too much about what the Army was really doing to my people." Catherine nearly dropped the bandage she was preparing. Dr. James Morrison wrote the definitive text on desert medicine. His work on treating gunshot wounds in extreme climates saved hundreds of lives during the Apache campaigns. "It also saved hundreds of Apache lives," Elena said quietly. When James realized that the medical intelligence he was providing was being used to plan attacks on civilian camps, he refused to continue. The Army declared him a deserter and put a price on his head. "He came to us for sanctuary, and eventually he became my husband." The implication struck Catherine like a physical blow. Dr. Morrison had been a legend in Territorial medical circles. His disappearance 5 years earlier had been attributed to an Apache raid on his research station. To learn that he had actually defected to join the people he was supposed to be fighting against added another layer of complexity to the corruption Nathan had described. "Is he still alive?" Catherine asked. Elena's hands paused in their work. "He died 3 winters ago, treating wounded warriors after a raid by the Crimson Creek Gang. A bullet that was meant for me found him instead." Her voice carried a pain that went beyond the immediate words. "But before he died, he taught me everything he knew about white man's medicine. He said someday there would be others who needed to learn how to heal and fight at the same time." Nathan stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering open as the fever medicine began to take effect. "Elena," he whispered. "I am here," she replied, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. "And I have brought you a new ally. Dr. Catherine Mills has left her old life behind to help continue James's work." Nathan's gaze found Catherine's face, and she saw recognition there, along with something that might have been gratitude or regret, perhaps both. "I never intended for you to sacrifice everything," he said weakly. "I know," Catherine replied, checking his pulse and finding it stronger than it had been. "But sometimes the right choice isn't the safe choice. Your friend Elena has been telling me about her husband's work. It seems I'm not the first physician to discover that healing and justice sometimes require the same courage. Over the following days, as Nathan's strength slowly returned and Catherine adapted to life in the hidden canyon, she began to understand the true scope of what she had become involved in. The Apache camp was not just a refuge, it was the center of an intelligence network that stretched across 3 territories. Warriors came and went like shadows, bringing information about government troop movements, mining company activities, and the ongoing crimes of the Crimson Creek Gang. Victorio himself proved to be a man of surprising depth and intelligence. He spoke fluent English, Spanish, and 3 Apache dialects, and his understanding of territorial politics was more sophisticated than most government officials Catherine had encountered. When he learned of her medical background, he asked her to examine several warriors who had been wounded in recent skirmishes. "Your people fight a war they cannot win," she told him bluntly after treating a young man who had taken a cavalry saber across his shoulder blade. "The government has unlimited resources and reinforcements. What can you hope to accomplish?" Victorio studied her for a long moment before answering. "We do not fight to win, Dr. Mills. We fight so that our children will remember how to fight. And we fight to make the cost of our destruction too high for those who profit from it." "Nathan says you've been helping him gather evidence against the conspiracy. Do you really believe that evidence can change anything?" "I believe that truth has power, even when it seems powerless," Victorio replied. "Your friend Nathan came to us broken and bitter, consumed by hatred for the men who betrayed him. But working with us has taught him something important, that justice is not the same as revenge, and that some fights are worth losing if they prepare the ground for others to win." Catherine spent her mornings treating patients and her afternoons learning from Elena about desert survival and Apache medicine. The combination of her formal medical training with traditional healing knowledge created new possibilities for treatment in the harsh environment. More importantly, it gave her a sense of purpose that her isolated practice in Copper Ridge had never provided. Nathan's recovery was remarkable, aided by the cooler mountain air and the stress relief that came from being surrounded by allies rather than enemies. As his strength returned, he began sharing more details about the evidence he had collected and the network of contacts who were working to expose the conspiracy. "There's a federal judge in Santa Fe named Harrison Wade," he explained to Catherine. One evening as they sat by the springs, watching the stars emerge in the canyon's narrow slice of sky. "He's one of the few officials in the territory who isn't compromised. If we can get the evidence to him, along with testimony from credible witnesses, he might be able to convene a grand jury." "What kind of witnesses?" Catherine asked. "Survivors of the raids, families who were driven from their land, military officers who were ordered to ignore atrocities, and physicians who can testify about the medical evidence of what was done to the victims." Catherine understood the implication immediately. "You want me to testify?" "I want you to have the choice," Nathan corrected. "Elena has agreed to go with us if we decide to take the evidence to Judge Wade. Her testimony about her husband's work and what he discovered about military complicity would be crucial. But having a physician with your credentials corroborate the medical evidence would make the case much stronger." The idea of testifying in federal court about conspiracy and murder should have terrified Catherine. Instead, she found herself considering the practical aspects: how to preserve the evidence during travel, how to ensure their safety on the journey to Santa Fe, how to present the medical testimony in a way that would be convincing to a jury. "There's another problem," she said after a moment. "Marshal Crawford. He's not going to give up just because we reached Apache territory. He'll be watching the roads, and he'll have bounty hunters looking for us in every town between here and Santa Fe." Nathan nodded grimly. "Crawford's dangerous because he's honest about his corruption. He knows exactly what he's doing and why, but his honesty might also be his weakness." "What do you mean?" "Crawford believes in the system he's serving, even when that system is corrupt. He thinks he's preserving law and order by protecting the conspiracy. If we could show him evidence that the people he's protecting are responsible for atrocities against civilians, you think he might turn against them? I think he might be willing to listen if we approached him the right way. Crawford's not evil, he's misguided. There's a difference. Catherine considered this as she watched the firelight dance across the canyon walls. In her medical practice, she had learned to distinguish between patients who were genuinely dangerous and those who were simply frightened or confused. The skill might translate to judging the character of a federal marshal who believed he was serving justice while protecting criminals. That's assuming we can get close enough to Crawford to present evidence without being arrested, she pointed out. Actually, Nathan said, I have an idea about that, but you're not going to like it. Over. The next week, Nathan outlined his plan. It was audacious to the point of seeming insane, but Catherine had to admit it had a certain logic. Rather than trying to evade Crawford and his men on the way to Santa Fe, they would arrange to meet with the marshal directly. Nathan would surrender himself, but under circumstances that would allow him to present the evidence before being taken into custody. The key is location, Nathan explained to the assembled group. Catherine, Elena, Victorio, and several Apache warriors who would serve as protection. We need a place where Crawford will feel safe enough to meet, but public enough that he won't risk violence against civilians. The territorial capital has a federal courthouse, Elena suggested. If we could arrange a meeting there with witnesses present. Crawford would never agree to that, Catherine objected. He'd assume it was a trap. Not if the meeting was arranged by someone he trusts, Nathan said. Someone with credibility who could vouch for our intentions. Catherine felt a chill of understanding. You want me to contact him? As Dr. Catherine Mills, a respected physician, who was briefly deceived by a wanted criminal, but who now wants to cooperate with federal authorities. You could say that you have information about my whereabouts, and that you're willing to testify about the medical evidence you observed, but only under specific conditions. The plan required Catherine to return to the world she had left behind, to resume an identity that no longer felt entirely real. But it also offered the possibility of confronting the conspiracy through legal channels rather than continued flight and violence. There's one more thing, Nathan added quietly. If this doesn't work, if Crawford refuses to listen, or if the evidence isn't enough to convince a grand jury, then we'll be completely exposed. There won't be any more chances to approach the system from within. Catherine looked around at the faces gathered in the firelight. Elena with her quiet strength, Victorio with his weathered wisdom, Nathan with his complex mixture of hope and desperation. She thought about Dr. Morrison, who had sacrificed his career and ultimately his life to serve justice rather than institutional loyalty. She thought about the victims of the Crimson Creek Gang, the families driven from their land, the Apache warriors fighting to protect their people against impossible odds. Then we'd better make sure it works, she said finally. As the meeting broke up and the others went to prepare for sleep, Nathan lingered by the springs. Catherine sat beside him, listening to the eternal sound of water flowing over stone. There's something I haven't told you, he said quietly, about why I've been able to stay ahead of Crawford and his men for so long. Catherine waited, sensing that this revelation would be important. I wasn't just a deputy marshal, Nathan continued. I was Crawford's partner. For 3 years, we worked together tracking criminals across the territory. I know how he thinks, how he operates, what his strengths and weaknesses are. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Catherine felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Nathan's knowledge of law enforcement procedures, his ability to anticipate Crawford's moves, the personal intensity she had sensed in the marshal's pursuit. He trained you, she said. He taught me everything I know about tracking, about reading sign, about thinking like both the hunter and the hunted. And when I went rogue, When I started robbing the banks and stagecoaches that were part of the conspiracy, it must have felt like the ultimate betrayal. Is that why you think he might listen? Because of your history together? Nathan was quiet for a long moment. I think he might listen because underneath all the corruption and institutional loyalty, Crawford is still the man who taught me that justice matters more than following orders. I have to believe that man is still in there somewhere. Catherine reached out and took Nathan's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his transformation from lawman to outlaw. And if he's not? If Crawford has changed too much to remember who he used to be, then we'll have learned something important about the price of institutional loyalty, Nathan replied. And we'll know that the only justice possible is the kind we create for ourselves. As they made their way back to the camp, Catherine realized that her bond with Nathan had evolved beyond the simple relationship between physician and patient. They were partners now, united by shared risk and common purpose. Whatever happened when they confronted Crawford and the conspiracy, they would face it together. The growing bond between them was more than trust or attraction. It was the recognition that some fights could only be won by people willing to lose everything for the chance to do what was right. And as Catherine fell asleep to the sound of Apache songs drifting through the canyon air, she knew that she had found something in this hidden valley that her respectable life in Copper Ridge had never offered. She had found a cause worth fighting for, and people worth fighting alongside. Whatever the cost, she was ready to pay it. 3 weeks after their arrival in the canyon, Catherine stood at the edge of the Apache camp, watching a dust cloud approach from the south. The rider was alone, moving fast but not with the urgency of pursuit. This was someone bringing news rather than fleeing danger. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the lean frame and distinctive riding style of Miguel Santos, one of Victorio's most trusted scouts. Miguel dismounted near the springs, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cooler mountain air. His face carried the grim expression of a man who had seen something that changed everything. And when Victorio emerged from his shelter to greet the scout, their conversation was conducted in rapid Apache that Catherine couldn't follow. Nathan appeared at her shoulder, his recovery now complete enough that he moved without the careful deliberation of an injured man. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. "I don't know, but it's not good news," Catherine replied, watching the increasingly animated discussion between Victorio and his scout. Elena joined them, her face pale as she listened to Miguel's report. When the conversation ended, Victorio's expression was darker than Catherine had ever seen it. The Apache leader approached their small group with the measured steps of someone delivering a death sentence. "Miguel brings word from our contacts in Tucson," Victorio said without preamble. "The conspiracy has learned of our location. Worse, they know about the evidence Nathan has collected and the testimony you were prepared to give." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice. "How is that possible? We've told no one outside this camp about our plans. Someone has been watching." "U.S.," Miguel said in accented English. "Someone with resources and patience. My contact in Tucson says federal marshals have been asking questions about Apache movements in the mountains. They know about the canyon, and they know we're here." Nathan's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "Crawford?" "No," Victorio said grimly. "Someone much more dangerous. Samuel Garrett himself has arrived in the territory with a company of hired guns. They're calling themselves federal deputies, but Miguel's sources say they're the same men who carried out the Crimson Creek massacre." The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Samuel Garrett, Nathan's former partner who had tried to kill him and started this entire nightmare. The corrupt marshal who had orchestrated the conspiracy's enforcement operations for years. If Garrett was personally involved, it meant the stakes had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. "How many men?" Nathan asked, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his body. 20 riders, all well-armed and experienced," Miguel replied. "They've established a base camp at Devil's Fork, 2 days' ride south of here. From there, they can control all the approaches to Apache territory. Elena stepped forward, her healer's instincts evident in her concerned expression. If Garrett knows we're here, he also knows about the evidence. He wouldn't risk direct confrontation unless he was certain he could eliminate all witnesses. Catherine's mind raced through the implications. Their carefully planned approach to Marshal Crawford was now impossible. Garrett would never allow them to reach Santa Fe alive. But more than that, their presence in the canyon had brought mortal danger. To Victorio's people, the Apache had provided sanctuary at considerable risk to themselves, and now that protection was about to be tested by the most dangerous men in the territory. "We have to leave," she said quietly. "Our presence here endangers everyone in the camp." Victoria's expression didn't change. "Where would you go?" "Garrett controls the southern approaches, and federal marshals are watching the northern routes. The eastern trail leads through mining country where the conspiracy has many allies." "West, then," Nathan said, "into the desert. If we can reach the Colorado River, you would die of thirst before you covered half the distance," Elena interrupted. "And even if you survived, Garrett would simply wait for you to emerge. Desert crossing in this season is suicide for anyone not born to it." Catherine felt the walls closing in around them. Every option led to death or capture, and their presence continued to endanger the people who had saved their lives. There had to be another way, but her mind struggled to find it through the fog of fear and desperation. "There is one possibility," Victorio said slowly, as if weighing each word carefully. "But it would require great risk from all of us, and success would depend on perfect timing and considerable luck." "What kind of possibility?" Nathan asked. "Garrett expects us to run or hide. He has positioned his men to control escape routes and approaches to the canyon. But he has made an assumption that we might be able to use against him." Catherine waited, sensing that whatever Victorio was about to propose would fundamentally change the nature of their situation. "He assumes we are the hunted," Victorio continued. "But hunters become vulnerable when they believe their prey is cornered. If we could reverse that situation, if we could become the hunters instead of the hunted." Nathan's eyes sharpened with understanding. "You're talking about attacking Garrett's camp." "I'm talking about eliminating the immediate threat while creating an opportunity to present your evidence through official channels," Victorio corrected. "But yes, that would require confronting Garrett directly." The audacity of the plan took Catherine's breath away. Instead of fleeing from Garrett's superior force, Victorio was suggesting they attack it. But as she considered the idea, she began to see the logic. Garrett's men were skilled at tracking and ambush, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who knew every rock and shadow in the surrounding mountains. "How would it work?" she asked. Victorio outlined the strategy with the precision of a military commander. Garrett's camp at Devil's Fork was positioned to control movement through the area, but that same positioning made it vulnerable to attack from the high ground. Apache warriors could approach through routes known only to them, while Nathan's knowledge of law enforcement tactics would help predict Garrett's defensive measures. "The goal would not be to kill Garrett's men," Victorio explained, "but to capture Garrett himself and enough evidence to prove his criminal activities. With Garrett in custody and documentation of his conspiracy, you could approach federal authorities from a position of strength rather than as fugitives." Catherine saw the brilliance of the plan, but also its enormous risks. "And if it fails? If Garrett escapes or if his men overwhelm your warriors?" "Then we die fighting rather than running," Elena said simply. "And perhaps our deaths will serve to warn others about what they face." The stark honesty of the statement crystallized something in Catherine's mind. She had been thinking like a physician, focused on preserving life and avoiding conflict. But the situation they faced required different thinking, the acceptance that some fights were worth the risk of death, and that avoiding those fights might lead to greater suffering for others. There's something else we need to consider, Nathan sighed quietly. If we capture Garrett, if we expose his role in the conspiracy, it won't end with him. The men funding his operations will simply find someone else to do their dirty work. We need more than just Garrett. We need the entire network. Miguel spoke up for the first time since delivering his initial report. My contacts in Tucson have learned something else. There is to be a meeting in 3 days' time. The men behind the conspiracy are gathering to plan their next phase of operations. If we could capture evidence of that meeting... Where? Catherine asked. The Copper King mine, west of Tucson. They believe themselves safe there because the mine is heavily guarded and isolated. But isolation works both ways. If we could infiltrate the meeting, we might be able to document the entire conspiracy in action. Catherine felt the pieces of a larger plan beginning to form. So we're not just talking about capturing Garrett. We're talking about exposing the entire network at once. It's ambitious, Nathan admitted. Perhaps too ambitious. We're talking about simultaneous operations against multiple targets, with limited resources and no backup if things go wrong. Vittorio studied Nathan's face carefully. You trained under Crawford. You know how federal law enforcement operates. Can it be done? Nathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly running through scenarios and contingencies in his mind. When he spoke again, his voice carried the confidence of someone who had made a difficult decision. It can be done, but not the way any of us are thinking. We're approaching this like separate problems. Garrett's force, the meeting at the mine, the evidence we need to present. But they're all part of the same system. If we want to bring down the system, we need to attack it as a system. What do you mean? Catherine asked. We don't capture Garrett to eliminate a threat, Nathan explained. We capture Garrett to use him as bait. We don't infiltrate the mine meeting to gather evidence. We infiltrate it to create a situation where the conspirators expose themselves to federal authorities who aren't compromised. Catherine began to understand. You want to force them into the open. I want to create a crisis that requires federal intervention at the highest levels, Nathan said. Something so public and so well documented that the conspiracy can't cover it up through their usual channels. Elena leaned forward, her healer's instincts clearly troubled by the direction the conversation was taking. What you're describing would put all of us at enormous risk. If the federal authorities you contact turn out to be compromised, we would be delivering ourselves directly to our enemies. That's why we need insurance, Nathan replied. Multiple layers of evidence, multiple witnesses, multiple ways of getting the story out, even if we don't survive to tell it ourselves. Over the next several hours, the plan evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than anyone had initially envisioned. Instead of a simple escape or rescue operation, they were planning a coordinated campaign designed to expose the entire conspiracy through a carefully orchestrated public crisis. The first phase would involve capturing Garrett and his men during their approach to the canyon. But instead of eliminating them, the Apache warriors would stage the capture to make it appear that Garrett's force had been destroyed by superior numbers. This would draw the conspiracy's leadership into defensive action, possibly including the meeting at the Copper King mine. The second phase would involve Catherine and Nathan infiltrating that meeting, not as spies but as apparent prisoners being delivered by someone the conspirators trusted. This would require creating false identities and establishing credible cover stories, all while maintaining access to the evidence needed to document the conspiracy's activities. The final phase would involve presenting the evidence and captured conspirators to federal authorities in a way that made cover-up impossible. This meant creating multiple copies of all documentation, establishing witnesses outside the conspiracy's reach, and timing the revelation for maximum public impact. It's insane, Catherine said when the planning session finally ended. We're going to get ourselves killed. Probably, Nathan agreed. But if we succeed, we'll save a lot of other people from getting killed. And if we fail spectacularly enough, we might still expose the conspiracy through the manner of our failure." Elena placed a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. "You have already sacrificed your old life for this cause. The question now is whether you're willing to risk your new life to see it through." Catherine looked around at the faces gathered in the firelight, Apache warriors, who had already sacrificed everything for their people's survival. A former deputy marshal who had given up his career and identity to fight corruption, a medicine woman who had lost her husband to the violence they were trying to stop. These people had already accepted the price of resistance. The only question was whether she had the courage to accept it as well. "When do we start?" she asked. Victorio smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Miguel will carry word to our allies throughout the territory. In 3 days, when the moon is dark, we begin the hunt." As the meeting dispersed and the camp settled into the quiet activities of evening, Catherine found herself walking alone to the springs where she had spent so many hours thinking through the implications of her choices. The sound of water flowing over stone had become a constant companion, a reminder that some things endured regardless of human ambition or conflict. Nathan found her there, as she had known he would. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert and watching stars emerge in the narrow slice of sky visible above the canyon walls. "Are you afraid?" he asked finally. Catherine considered the question carefully. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting down all the people who are depending on us to get this right." "Elena told me something her husband used to say," Nathan replied. "He said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else is more important than fear." "What's more important to you?" Catherine asked. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Justice, I suppose. The idea that actions have consequences, and that powerful people can't simply do whatever they want to innocent victims without eventually paying a price." Catherine nodded, understanding completely. "For me, it's the oath I took when I became a physician. First, do no harm. I can't do no harm by standing aside while people suffer and die for other people's profit." They sat together until the fire died down and the camp grew quiet around them. Tomorrow would begin the most dangerous phase of their resistance against the conspiracy, a phase that would likely end in either triumph or death. But tonight, in the hidden canyon that had become their sanctuary, Catherine felt a peace she hadn't experienced since leaving Copper Ridge. She had found her place in the fight for justice, and she had found people worth fighting alongside. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she would face it with the knowledge that she had chosen to stand with the right side. Regardless of the personal cost, the revelation that Garrett was closing in had transformed their situation from refuge to crisis. But it had also clarified something essential about who they were and what they were willing to sacrifice for their cause. The hunters were about to become the hunted, but Catherine Mills was no longer the same woman who had nervously treated a wounded stranger in her small desert practice. She was a warrior in the service of healing, and she was ready for whatever came next. The attack on Garrett's camp began before dawn on the moonless night Victorio had chosen. Catherine crouched among the rocks above Devil's Fork, her medical bag secured across her shoulder and her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Apache warriors move like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness. The camp below showed no signs of alertness. Garrett's men had grown complacent in their assumed superiority, posting minimal guards and trusting their reputation to keep enemies at bay. Nathan lay beside her, a captured rifle in his hands and his face painted with the dark clay Elena had provided for camouflage. 3 weeks of recovery in the canyon had restored not just his physical strength, but something deeper, the focused intensity of a man who had found his purpose again. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, calculated to carry no further than her ears. "Garrett's in the largest tent, center of the camp. Victorio's warriors will take the sentries first, then move inward in a spiral. Our job is to make sure Garrett doesn't escape in the confusion. Catherine nodded, checking the small signal mirror. That would allow her to communicate with the Apache positions surrounding the camp. The plan required precision timing too early, and Garrett's men would have time to organize a defense. Too late, and the corrupt marshal might slip away in the chaos of battle. A night bird called from across the canyon Victorio's signal that his men were in position. Catherine felt her breathing slow as adrenaline sharpened her senses to crystalline clarity. Everything they had worked toward, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the next few minutes. The first sentry died silently, an Apache arrow finding his heart before he could raise an alarm. The second fell to a knife blade across his throat, his body lowered gently to prevent the sound of collapse. Within moments, the perimeter guards had been eliminated with the ghostly efficiency that had made Apache warriors legendary throughout the territory. Then the real attack began. Victorio's men struck the camp like a desert storm, sudden, overwhelming, and seemingly from all directions at once. Shouts erupted from the tents as Garrett's hired guns stumbled into wakefulness only to find themselves surrounded by warriors who knew the terrain and the darkness far better than their opponents ever could. Gunfire erupted in scattered bursts, muzzle flashes strobing through the pre-dawn gloom like deadly lightning. But the Apache had planned for this. Their initial assault targeted the camp's horses and supply wagons, eliminating any possibility of organized retreat or sustained resistance. Catherine watched. Nathan moved down the rocky slope with fluid precision, his knowledge of law enforcement tactics allowing him to predict where Garrett would position himself for either command or escape. She followed close behind, her medical training overriding her fear as she prepared to treat wounded warriors, or, if necessary, to keep Garrett alive for interrogation. The corrupt marshal emerged from his tent already dressed and armed, his survival instincts clearly honed by years of dangerous work. But instead of rallying his men or attempting to fight, Garrett did something that surprised everyone. He raised his hands in surrender, his weapon held high and unthreatening. "I want a parley," he shouted over the gunfire. "Victorio, I know you're out there. I want to make a deal." The fighting slowed and then stopped as Apache warriors waited for their leader's response. Victorio materialized from the shadows like a conjured spirit, his rifle trained on Garrett's chest, but his finger relaxed on the trigger. "Samuel Garrett," the Apache leader said in perfect English. "The man who orchestrated the murder of my son. What kind of deal could you possibly offer that would interest me?" Garrett's smile was cold and calculating, even with a dozen weapons aimed at his heart. "The kind of deal that gives you everything you want, the complete destruction of the conspiracy that's been bleeding this territory dry for 5 years. Catherine felt Nathan tense beside her. This wasn't part of their plan. Garrett was supposed to be captured, not offering cooperation. But as she watched the corrupt marshal's face in the growing dawn light, she saw something unexpected there. Not the desperation of a trapped man, but the confidence of someone who held cards no one else knew about. "Explain," Victoria said simply. Garrett gestured toward his scattered men, most of whom were now bound with Apache rope and looking distinctly uncomfortable with their situation. "These men aren't here to capture Nathan Blake or eliminate Apache resistance. They're here because the conspiracy is about to collapse, and certain powerful people want to eliminate anyone who knows too much about their activities, including you," Nathan called out, emerging from his concealment with his rifle trained on his former colleague. Garrett's expression shifted when he saw Nathan, revealing a complex mixture of regret, anger, and what might have been relief. "Hello, partner. You're looking better than the last time I saw you." "The last time you saw me, you shot me and left me for dead," Nathan replied coldly. "The last time I saw you, I saved your life by making it look like you were dead," Garrett corrected. "If the conspiracy had known you survived that first confrontation, They would have sent killers instead of marshals to hunt you down. Catherine felt the world shift around her as the implications of Garrett's words sank in. You're saying you've been protecting Nathan by hunting him. Garrett's laugh was bitter. I'm saying I've been trying to keep him alive long enough to help me bring down the men who destroyed both our careers and turned us into criminals. Nathan's rifle didn't waver, but Catherine could see confusion replacing certainty in his expression. That's impossible. You betrayed me to the Crimson Creek gang. You took money from the conspiracy. I took money from the conspiracy to get close enough to learn how it operates, Garrett said. And yes, I fed information to the gang false. Information designed to keep them away from targets that might have led back to me before I could gather enough evidence to destroy the entire network. Victorio stepped closer, his dark eyes studying Garrett's face with the intensity of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the truth in people's expressions. You claim to be working against the conspiracy, yet your actions have resulted in the deaths of many innocent people. My actions have prevented the deaths of many more innocent people, Garrett replied. Every false trail I gave the gang, every misdirection I provided, every time I warned potential victims without revealing my true allegiance, all of it was designed to minimize casualties while I built a case that could bring down the entire operation. Catherine stepped forward, her medical training compelling her to examine Garrett's claims with the same analytical approach she used to diagnose illness. If what you're saying is true, why didn't you contact Nathan directly? Why maintain the pretense of hunting him? Because Nathan was too angry to think clearly, Garrett said, his gaze meeting his former partner's eyes. And because the conspiracy has informants everywhere, including within federal law enforcement. The only way to protect Nathan and gather the evidence we needed was to make it appear that I was still loyal to the corrupt officials, while secretly working against them. Nathan's rifle slowly lowered as he processed this information. The evidence you collected is sitting in a federal courthouse in Denver, along with sworn affidavits from dozens of witnesses and complete financial records of the conspiracy's operations. Garrett finished. Federal Judge Marcus Townsend has been reviewing it for 3 weeks, and yesterday he issued sealed indictments against 47 individuals, including territorial officials, military officers, and prominent businessmen. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the canyon and the distant call of a hawk riding the morning thermals. Catherine felt as though she was watching the pieces of an enormous puzzle suddenly snap into place, revealing a picture that was both simpler and more complex than anything they had imagined. The meeting at the Copper King mine, Alina said, speaking for the first time since the attack began. If indictments have already been issued, the meeting is a trap, Garrett confirmed. Judge Townsend's plan to arrest the entire leadership of the conspiracy in one location. But the judge needed credible witnesses to the conspiracy's activities. People who could testify about specific crimes and provide context for the documentary evidence. Nathan stared at his former partner with an expression of dawning understanding. You've been hurting us toward this moment. The pursuit, the pressure, making us desperate enough to take risks. I've been trying to keep you alive long enough to serve as witnesses, Garrett said. Dr. Mills can testify about the medical evidence of atrocities committed by the gang. Victorio can provide testimony about military complicity in attacks on civilian populations. Elena can speak to her husband's work and the evidence he gathered before his death. Catherine felt a mixture of relief and anger washing over her. Relief that the desperate situation they had been navigating was not as hopeless as it had seemed. Anger that they had been manipulated, even if that manipulation had been intended to protect them. And Nathan? She asked. Nathan can provide insider testimony about how the conspiracy operated, how it recruited and controlled participants, and how it covered up its crimes through official channels, Garrett replied. His evidence, combined with the documentary proof and witness testimony, will be enough to convict everyone involved and dismantle the entire network. Victorio had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of a man who had learned to evaluate information carefully before acting on it. Now he stepped forward, his rifle still ready but no longer directly threatening. "Assuming what you say is true," the Apache leader said, "what happens to my people? Will federal justice extend to protecting Apache rights, or will we simply face a new set of oppressors?" Garrett's expression grew serious. "Judge Thompson has reviewed the evidence of military misconduct in attacks on Apache settlements. The indictments include several Army officers who exceeded their authority in conducting operations against non-combatant populations. There will be official recognition that federal forces committed crimes against your people. Recognition is not the same as justice," Victorio replied. "What concrete protections will be offered?" "The conspiracy's landholdings will be forfeited to the federal government," Garrett explained. "Judge Thompson has indicated that traditional Apache territories will be returned to tribal control, with guaranteed water rights and protection from mining interests." Catherine saw the careful hope that flickered in Victorio's eyes, tempered by the wariness of a man who had been betrayed by federal promises too many times to trust easily. But she also saw the recognition that this might be the best opportunity his people would have to secure their future through legal means rather than continued warfare. "There's one more thing," Nathan said quietly. "If this is all true, if you've been working to expose the conspiracy all along, why did you shoot me? Why stage my death?" Garrett's expression grew pained. "Because I'd learned that the conspiracy had issued a kill order on you. Not capture kill. They knew you were getting too close to the truth, and they had decided you were too dangerous to leave alive. The only way to protect you was to make them believe you were already dead. So you shot me. I shot you in a location where I knew you would survive if you received medical attention quickly. And I made sure Apache scouts found you before you bled to death. It was the only way to get you off the conspiracy's target list, while keeping you available to testify when the time came." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling to reconcile years of anger and mistrust with this new understanding of events. Catherine could see the internal battle playing out across his features, the desire to believe warring with the caution that had kept him alive through months of being hunted. "Prove it," Nathan said finally. Garrett reached slowly into his coat, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and withdrew a folded document bearing official federal seals. "Sealed indictments, signed 3 days ago. Your name is listed as a protected witness, not as a defendant." Nathan examined the document carefully, his law enforcement training evident in the way he checked seals, signatures, and official markings. When he looked up, his expression had changed fundamentally. "It's legitimate," he said to Catherine and the others. "These are real federal indictments, and they include everyone we suspected of being part of the conspiracy." Catherine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. The desperate flight, the constant danger, the sense that they were fighting an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. All of it was about to end, not in death or failure, but in the kind of institutional justice they had never dared to hope for. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we travel to Denver under federal protection," Garrett said. "You testify before Judge Thompson's grand jury. The indictments are unsealed, and the conspiracy is dismantled through legal process instead of continued violence." Elena stepped forward, her healer's wisdom evident in her careful questions. "And after the testimony? What happens to those of us who have been marked as enemies by powerful men?" "You disappear into new lives with new identities, if that's what you choose," Garrett replied. "Or you remain to help rebuild the institutions that were corrupted, if you're willing to take on that responsibility." Catherine looked around at the faces of the people who had become her allies and friends through this incredible ordeal. Nathan, whose quest for justice had nearly cost him everything. Elena, whose quiet strength had sustained them all. Victorio, whose wisdom had shown them how to fight without losing their humanity. And now Garrett, whose complex deception had apparently been designed to protect rather than betray. "I have one condition," she said finally. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The people of Copper Ridge still need medical care. Whatever happens with the conspiracy, whatever new life I might choose, there are people in that town who depend on having a physician available. I won't abandon them." Garrett smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "Judge Thompson has authorized the establishment of a federal medical clinic in Copper Ridge, with full funding for supplies and equipment. If you're willing to return there, you'll do so with resources you never had before." Catherine felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes. She could return home, not just to the place, but to the work that had always defined her purpose. But she would return as someone fundamentally changed by everything she had experienced. "Then yes," she said, "I'll testify. We'll all testify. And then we'll help you rebuild what was broken." As the sun rose fully over Devil's Fork, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Catherine realized that the most wanted desperado in 3 territories had led them not to destruction, but to the kind of justice that could heal an entire region. The unexpected resolution had revealed that sometimes the greatest courage came not from fighting the system, but from working within it to restore what it was supposed to be. The war was over. The real work was about to begin. 6 months after the federal trials that dismantled the conspiracy, Catherine stood in the doorway of her rebuilt medical practice in Copper Ridge, watching the morning sun paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. The town had changed dramatically since her return. New businesses lined the main street. Families had moved back to reclaim abandoned homesteads, and the sound of children's laughter once again echoed through neighborhoods that had been silent for too long. The federal medical clinic bore little resemblance to her old practice. Gone were the days of ration supplies and makeshift equipment. The examination rooms were fitted with the latest surgical instruments, pharmaceutical cabinets stocked with medications she'd only dreamed of having access to, and a small hospital ward that could handle serious cases without requiring dangerous transport to distant cities. Most importantly, she was no longer working alone. Dr. Marcus Chen had arrived 3 months ago, a young physician from San Francisco who had volunteered for territorial service after reading about the medical work being done in post-conspiracy Arizona. His expertise in infectious diseases complemented Catherine's surgical skills, and together they had established the most advanced medical facility between Tucson and Flagstaff. "The morning patients are ready," Marcus called from the main examination room. "Mrs. Henderson's baby is due for his 2-month checkup, and old Pete Morrison wants you to look at that hand he injured working on the new well." Catherine smiled at the mention of Pete, whose help during her desperate escape had been instrumental in their eventual success. The livery stable owner had become something of a local hero when the truth about the conspiracy emerged, though. He steadfastly insisted he'd simply been helping a friend in need. "Tell Pete I'll be right there," Catherine replied, making one final check of the surgical bay where she'd performed 3 operations. The previous week, a broken leg from a construction accident, an emergency appendectomy, and the removal of a bullet from a rancher who'd had an unfortunate encounter with claim jumpers. All 3 patients had recovered completely, a success rate that would have been impossible under her old conditions. As she moved through the clinic, Catherine reflected on how dramatically her understanding of medical practice had evolved. Working with Elena in the Apache camp had taught her the value of combining traditional healing knowledge with modern surgical techniques. The federal medical program had provided resources and support that allowed her to implement treatment protocols she'd never imagined possible in a frontier setting. But the most profound change wasn't in her medical capabilities. It was in her understanding of how healing and justice were fundamentally connected. The conspiracy's reign of terror had made medical practice nearly impossible throughout the territory. Families afraid to seek help, communities isolated by violence, resources diverted to serve criminal enterprises rather than legitimate needs. Breaking the conspiracy hadn't just restored law and order. It had restored the conditions necessary for healing to flourish. The morning passed quickly with routine examinations and minor procedures. Mrs. Henderson's baby was thriving. Pete's hand required only cleaning and rebandaging, and a young cowboy needed stitches after an argument with a particularly ornery steer. It was exactly the kind of normal, everyday medical work that Catherine had once taken for granted, but now treasured as evidence of a community returning to health. Around midday, as she was updating patient records in her office, Catherine heard the distinctive sound of a wagon approaching. Through her window, she could see Nathan climbing down from the driver's seat of a supply wagon loaded with construction materials. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world, though she could still see the faint scar near his heart where Garrett's bullet had marked the beginning of their extraordinary journey together. Nathan had declined the federal witness protection program, choosing instead to remain in Arizona and help with the territory's reconstruction. His knowledge of criminal networks and investigative procedures had made him invaluable to the federal marshals working to root out the remaining elements of corruption. More personally, his relationship with Catherine had deepened from partnership, born of necessity, into something that promised permanence and joy. "Afternoon, Dr. Mills," Nathan said as he entered the clinic, touching his hat brim in the gesture that had become familiar and dear to her. "I've got that medical equipment you ordered from Denver, plus some interesting news from the territorial capital." Catherine emerged from her office to greet him, noting the subtle excitement in his expression that suggested the news was particularly significant. "Good news or complicated news?" "Probably both," Nathan replied, beginning to unload wooden crates marked with the distinctive seals of Federal Medical Supply Services. "The territorial governor has officially requested statehood for Arizona. The Federal Review Commission will be arriving next month to evaluate whether the territory is ready for self-governance." Catherine felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with concern. Statehood would bring many benefits: better representation in Congress, increased federal investment in infrastructure, formal recognition of Arizona's progress towards civilized governance. But it would also mean increased scrutiny of everything they had accomplished since the conspiracy's fall. "What's the assessment likely to be?" she asked, helping Nathan carry the heavier crates into the supply room. "Officially, excellent. Crime rates are down 70%, economic development is accelerating, and the territorial government has demonstrated its ability to function without federal oversight. The Apache treaties have created lasting peace with the indigenous populations, and the land redistribution program has established stable agricultural communities throughout the region." Catherine smiled at the pride evident in Nathan's voice. He had been instrumental in many of these achievements, working with federal officials to design policies that addressed the root causes of territorial instability rather than simply treating the symptoms. "And unofficially?" she prompted. Nathan's expression grew more serious. "Unofficially, there are still powerful interests in Washington who aren't happy about how the conspiracy was exposed. Some influential people lost substantial investments when the criminal enterprises were dismantled, and they're looking for ways to challenge the legitimacy of the federal intervention." Catherine understood the implications immediately. They want to discredit the trials and reverse the reforms. They want to find technical grounds to argue that the federal actions exceeded constitutional authority, Nathan confirmed. "If they succeed, it could undermine everything we've accomplished and potentially restore some of the old power structures." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena, whose transformation since the conspiracy's fall had been as dramatic as Catherine's own. The Apache medicine woman now served as the director of the Territorial Health Initiative, a federal program that combined traditional healing practices with modern medical care. Her husband's research had been posthumously recognized by the medical establishment, and Elena herself had become a respected voice in territorial health policy. Catherine, Nathan, Elena greeted them with the warm familiarity of shared danger. Survived and common purpose sustained. I hope you're prepared for visitors. Marshal Crawford is riding in with a small escort, and he appears to be in quite a hurry. Catherine felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Crawford's name. The federal marshal had become an unlikely ally after the truth about the conspiracy emerged, but his presence usually signaled significant developments, either opportunities or threats that required immediate attention. Any idea what brings him here? Nathan asked. None, Elena replied, but I suspect it's connected to the statehood review. There have been federal investigators asking questions throughout the territory about the methods used to expose the conspiracy. Some of the questions suggest they're looking for irregularities they can exploit. Through the clinic's front window, Catherine could see Crawford and his men approaching through the heat shimmer that still marked Arizona's desert climate. The marshal looked every bit as formidable as he had during their first confrontation, but his bearing now carried the authority of a man serving justice rather than institutional corruption. Crawford dismounted and approached the clinic with the measured steps of someone bearing important news. When Catherine opened the door to greet him, his expression was carefully neutral, neither threatening nor reassuring. Dr. Mills, Mr. Blake, Mrs. Santos. Crawford nodded to each of them in turn. I'm afraid I have both good news and troubling news to share. Which would you prefer first? The troubling news, Catherine said without hesitation. I've learned it's better to understand the problems before celebrating the solutions. Crawford's slight smile suggested he approved of her approach. A federal review board has been convened to investigate the methods used in exposing the territorial conspiracy. The investigation is being led by Senator Richard Blackwood Nathaniel, Blackwood's uncle, who has significant political influence and substantial financial interests in mining operations. Catherine felt her blood chill. The senator's connection to Nathan's assumed identity created obvious conflicts of interest, and his mining investment suggested he might have been connected to the conspiracy they had worked so hard to expose. The senators arguing that the federal intervention exceeded constitutional limits and that the trials were conducted based on evidence obtained through illegal means. Crawford continued. If his review board concludes that the prosecutions were improper, it could result in the convictions being overturned and many of the reforms being reversed. Nathan stepped forward, his jaw set with the determination Catherine had learned to recognize. What kind of evidence is he claiming was illegally obtained? Testimony from witnesses who were technically fugitives from federal law, evidence gathered during unauthorized operations on Apache territory, and documentation obtained through methods that allegedly violated due process protections. Crawford listed grimly. Elena's expression darkened. In other words, he's arguing that fighting corruption through irregular channels invalidates the evidence of that corruption. Precisely, Crawford confirmed. It's a sophisticated legal argument that could potentially undo everything we've accomplished, even though the underlying evidence of criminal activity is overwhelming. Catherine felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. They had fought so hard to establish justice and restore legitimate governance to the territory. The idea that their success could be reversed through legal technicalities seemed both infuriating and deeply unjust. You said there was good news as well, she said. Crawford's expression brightened considerably. The good news is that Senator Blackwood has agreed to hold public hearings as part of his review. He's apparently confident that the evidence will support his conclusions about federal overreach. What he doesn't know is that we've spent the past 6 months preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. Nathan's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of preparation? Additional evidence, corroborating witnesses, and documentation that was obtained through completely legitimate channels, Crawford explained. Judge Thompson has been working with federal investigators to build a parallel case that would withstand even the most stringent constitutional scrutiny. Catherine began to understand. You're going to use Blackwood's own hearings to present evidence that proves the conspiracy was even more extensive than originally revealed. We're going to demonstrate that the irregular methods used were not only justified by the circumstances, but that they were the only way to expose criminal activity that had completely corrupted normal legal channels, Crawford confirmed. And we're going to do it with Senator Blackwood serving as our unwitting prosecutor. Alina leaned forward with obvious interest. What role do you need us to play in these hearings? The same role you played in the original trials, Crawford replied. Tell the truth about what you experienced, what you witnessed, and what you discovered. But this time, you'll be doing it with the full support of the federal government and with evidence that eliminates any question about the legitimacy of our methods. Catherine looked around at her companions, Nathan with his complex history of law enforcement and outlawry, Alina with her bridge between two cultures and two medical traditions, Crawford with his evolution from institutional enforcer to servant of justice. They had all been transformed by their struggle against the conspiracy, and now they were being asked to defend not just their actions, but the principles that had guided those actions. When do the hearings begin? She asked. Next month, in conjunction with the statehood review, Crawford replied. Senator Blackwood wants to use the hearings to demonstrate that Arizona isn't ready for self-governance because its recent history demonstrates contempt for federal authority and constitutional process. Nathan laughed, the sound carrying more confidence than humor. He's going to prove exactly the opposite. By the time we're finished testifying, the hearings will demonstrate that Arizona has earned statehood precisely because its people were willing to fight for justice when federal institutions failed to protect them. Catherine felt a familiar surge of determination, the same clarity of purpose that had driven her to help a wounded stranger and ultimately challenge an entire conspiracy. The fight wasn't over, perhaps it never would be, but she had learned that some fights were worth sustaining regardless of their difficulty. Then we'd better make sure we're ready, she said. The rest of the afternoon was spent planning testimony and reviewing evidence, but as evening approached and her companions departed to make their own preparations, Catherine found herself walking through Copper Ridge's transformed streets. Children played in yards where families had returned to rebuild their lives. Merchants sold goods in shops that had been abandoned during the conspiracy's reign of terror. Gardens flourished where people felt safe enough to plant for the future. Nathan found her there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of rose and gold. They walked together without speaking for a while, two people who had found each other through extraordinary circumstances and chosen to build something lasting from their shared trials. Are you ready for another fight? Nathan asked as they paused near the spot where his horse had collapsed and their journey together had truly begun. Catherine considered the question seriously. I'm ready to defend what we've built. I'm ready to protect the people who depend on the changes we've made. I'm ready to stand up for the principle that healing and justice are stronger than corruption and violence, even if it means risking everything again. Catherine smiled, thinking of the oath she had taken as a physician and how much her understanding of that oath had evolved. Especially if it means risking everything again. Some things are worth the risk. As they walked back toward the clinic that had become the symbol of Copper Ridge's rebirth, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had changed since the night she chose to save a wounded stranger. She had lost the quiet, predictable existence she had once thought she wanted, but she had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that she could make a difference in the struggle between justice and corruption, between healing and harm. The new beginning stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility. There would be more challenges, more impossible choices, more moments when doing the right thing would require risking everything they had built. But Catherine Mills was no longer the isolated frontier physician who had once worked alone in a dying town. She was part of something larger, now a community of people committed to justice, a network of allies willing to fight for what was right, a movement that had transformed not just a territory, but the very meaning of courage and compassion in an unforgiving world. The most wanted desperado in 3 territories had led her to become exactly who she was meant to be. And as the stars emerged over the Arizona desert, Catherine knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through the dark nights when everything seemed lost. The story that had begun with a bullet wound and a choice to help a stranger had become something larger, a testament to the power of ordinary people to change the world through extraordinary courage. And in the rebuilt town of Copper Ridge, under the vast western sky, that story continued to unfold with each life saved, each wrong righted, and each new day that dawned on a territory transformed by the simple decision to choose justice over safety. The new beginning was just that, a beginning. And Catherine Mills was ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.